Now we move on to the case studies, which will be taken by Taylor Wilkerson. So far, so good. Okay.
Thank you, Pam. While we're getting the slides up, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. A couple years ago, when LMI first started talking with people that deliver about getting involved, I went to a conference, and there was a panel discussion there on workforce management and supply chain. And at that time, the themes were coming out from this panel of the problems they were having. The policies and position descriptions were old. They didn't fit the needs of the organization today and into the future. It was difficult for them to find people qualified to do the jobs they needed done in the supply chain. People didn't stay with the organization. They got the experience they wanted and left. And supply chain was not advocated as a career path. As students in secondary schools were getting ready to go to university, they weren't told about supply chain and logistics as a possible career path they could go into. Now, the interesting thing is the people on this panel were not involved in public health. They're from General Electric, IBM, Boeing Company. So when we talk about case studies and who can benefit from sharing practices on developing and growing the workforce and supply chain, it's not just the people in global health. This is a problem that is prevalent across all supply chain organizations. So I think it's important to understand it within that context. What I'm going to talk about today is the development of some supply chain case studies that we've been working on with people that deliver. And I call this initial results, and it's initial results because as of right now, we have 2 case studies. We'd like to have more. So if anybody would like to contribute any, I'd be happy to hear from you. So what we did is people that deliver, the board decided that case studies would be a useful tool for advocacy and knowledge sharing. Case studies present how organizations have dealt with workforce development issues, how they've solved those issues, what works, what doesn't work, as well as some of the journey that they've been along. So we went out and contacted several organizations, asked them to participate. 2 agreed, the Imperial Health Sciences and Sudan Central Medical Stores Public Corporation. And the focus of the case studies is on how these organizations have managed their workforce, developed their workforce, and continue to grow their workforce. And the results, as we'll talk about this morning, show that there's a benefit to taking a holistic or complete approach to managing the workforce. The reason for using case studies, again, is really that case studies, when you talk about developing evidence-based solutions, case studies provide evidence of how other organizations have successfully addressed workforce issues, or in some cases maybe not successfully, where they still are having issues, what hasn't worked that they've tried. They're a knowledge sharing tool because they show what has actually been put in place. This isn't an academic discussion of things that should work. This is what organizations have actually used that actually has worked. And they also provide an understanding of the context, the journey that these organizations have taken to get where they are. So it's not just about here are things we're doing, but it's here's how we got there. Here's the problems we had along the way. Here are things that we found that we tried that didn't work. So it become a very useful way of sharing knowledge about how to manage the workforce in a very practical context. Now, we used the framework that People That Deliver is based upon as the same framework for these case studies, because we looked at this and said this is a good way to discuss different ways that, or different things you have to do to manage the workforce in your supply chain, and what are the activities taking place within each of those areas. So it includes engaged stakeholders. So who do you view as the people you have to answer to as you execute your supply chain? Plans and policies. What is your strategy? What are your rules and requirements for the workforce in your supply chain? Workforce development. How do you grow your workforce, grow the people you have today into the people you need tomorrow? Increase performance. How do you link what you're doing in managing your workforce to the results from your supply chain? And lastly, professionalization is what this entire panel is talking about. How do you bring logistics and supply chain out of the realm of something, the necessary evil of a health system, to something that adds value to the health system, where it's respected, where people think about engaging the supply chain community when they talk about improving healthcare. So our approach to conducting these case studies is fairly simple. We first decided on the structure, the framework for the case studies, including the questionnaires or the questions we wanted to ask. We identified the organizations we wanted to pursue, contacted them, got agreement. We conducted interviews, collected additional documents because we didn't want it just to be based on interviews. We wanted to collect examples of the policies they had, how they conduct performance reviews, things of that nature. And then putting the case studies into what's now a draft format. So I mentioned the two case studies we have so far, Imperial Health Sciences and the Central Medical Supplies Public Corporation of Sudan. I was very happy that of the two, we have a good example of a public sector supply chain organization and a private sector supply chain organization. And I think that was very good because as we compared these, you can see the differences and the similarities in how these two types of organizations approach workforce management. And it also provides a good breadth in terms of the examples we're able to provide through these case studies. So even though we only have two case studies so far, there are some results that we see emerging, or some themes that we see emerging from these case studies in terms of successful practices for workforce management. The first, in the area of stakeholders. The definition of your stakeholders matters in terms of how you're going to develop your workforce and manage your supply chain. Both organizations that we engaged, when we talked about who their stakeholders are, gave us a fairly long list. They didn't view it as just the populations they serve or the donors. They viewed it as a broad range of stakeholders that they had to answer to, and they developed their workforce, the skills they needed to answer to those stakeholders or to support those stakeholders. The second, in policies and plans. First point is including HR, including the workforce in your supply chain strategy. As you're thinking what your supply chain needs to be going into the future, identifying the skills that are needed to support that. The other thing that came out is that the best policies and plans that are being used don't address just what the workforce is you need today. They address how you're going to grow your workforce into what you're going to need tomorrow, identifying those future needs, and the workforce is going to meet those future needs. And that links very closely to the area of workforce development. Understanding the needs. So one of the things that both organizations did very well is understanding exactly what are the skills and competencies they needed to have in their supply chain, and then identifying ways to take the people they have and develop them into the people they need in the future, develop those skills. Good use of external resources, so not just thinking that you have to do all the training and development internally, using universities, using external organizations. And probably most importantly, specifically reserving resources for workforce development. So when you're dealing with the workforce, not just saying, I'm going to hire somebody, tell them to do their job, and hope they continue doing it well, but saying, I want them to do their job, but also I'm going to specifically reserve their time, reserve funding to develop them, to continue training them, to continue making them a better employee of the supply chain. Third is linking workforce to supply chain performance. So understanding how the workforce contributes to the results of the supply chain, and putting the incentives into place. So it's not just enough to tell somebody that's working in a warehouse that they're part of a bigger system, that their job has more importance, but putting the incentives, helping them understand exactly what they should be doing to help that greater good, and incentivizing them to do that. And clearly communicating the expectations. So not just show up on time, do your work, but what are the expectations in terms of the things they need to do to contribute to that larger supply chain. And then lastly, that area of professionalization. So taking the supply chain out of the realm of, again, just the necessary evil of getting things from supplier to the clinic to a higher level of capability. And here, what we've seen is a lot of engagement of the external community. So a lot of work with community organizations or industry groups that are focused on supply chains, where the workforce has opportunity to network, to understand how others are doing things, to share practices, as well as engaging local universities, local education system to develop curriculums that support a supply chain workforce. So where do we go from here? First thing we want to do is identify more case studies. 2 case studies is great. We'd love to have many more, so there's more examples of how organizations approach this complex issue of managing the workforce in the supply chain. We're looking for public and private examples, as well as cross-industry examples. You know, I started off mentioning that the panel discussion for a reason, that we believe that it's not just the health industry that has useful examples for the health industry. So even if the examples come from outside of the health industry, we'd love to hear about it. And if anybody here would like to volunteer, please come see me at some point over the next 2 days. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Second is promoting best practices. So as we compile these case studies and we see the emerging themes, such as the one that I just talked about, we have that opportunity to start bringing out what are the best practices, what are the things that seem to work across organizations, across industries for developing the workforce. And we want to be able to communicate those, not just in terms of saying, again, not just this is something you should do, but why you should do it. What are the benefits of doing this, and how do you do it? What's the way to get from where you are to implementing this best practice? And then lastly, using the case studies as a foundation for further research. As we start understanding how organizations are really wrestling with these workforce issues, that becomes a way, a foundation to conduct further research into what needs to be done to further improve workforce management within the supply chain. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very
That's an overview
much.
of the case studies.